We open in a smoke-filled map room in London, sometime around 1910. Senior officers and colonial planners stand over a vast wall map of Europe and the Middle East. Thick red lines mark British sea routes to India through Gibraltar and Suez, but someone has drawn a new black line that does not follow the seas at all. It begins in Berlin, runs southeast through Vienna and the Balkans, slices across Anatolia, and ends at the shores of the Persian Gulf near Basra. One of the men runs a finger along this iron path. "If they finish this," he mutters, "we can't stop them with a single ship." On the walls are portraits of admirals and past victories. On the table is a sketch of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, a project that threatens the very foundations of Britain's global empire. In school, we are told that World War I began with 2 bullets in Sarajevo and a tragic tangle of alliances. But the men in this room are not talking about an archduke. They are talking about a train. The question that drives this story is simple and unsettling. How much of the catastrophe that followed was really about stopping that black line from reaching the sea? To see why a stretch of track could terrify the world's greatest empire, we first need to understand how Britain ruled. At the turn of the 20th century, London presided over a global system built on 2 pillars. The first was the Royal Navy, an armada of steel that controlled the world's major sea lanes. British warships guarded the approaches to Europe, the Cape of Good Hope, the Straits of Malacca. The second was geography, the Suez Canal in Egypt. Seized and militarized in the late 19th century, Suez was the empire's jugular, the shortcut that connected the factories of Manchester and the banks of the city to the markets and manpower of India, the crown jewel of British possessions. Any merchant wanting to send goods from Europe to India, China, or the Far East had little choice but to pass through British watched waters and British-controlled chokepoints. Britain wrapped this arrangement in the language of free trade. But in practice, control of routes meant control of who could trade at all, and on what terms. Now shift the camera to the new challenger on the European continent, Germany. Unified only in 1871, it was a latecomer to empire, but a prodigy in industry. German chemists led the world in dyes and pharmaceuticals. German steel mills churned out rails and guns at unprecedented scale. German universities and laboratories became global centers of science. Yet this new industrial giant was trapped in an unfavorable position. It possessed few colonies, no sprawling overseas market, and a navy too small to confront Britain head-on. Geographically, it was boxed in, surrounded by rival powers and locked in the center of the European landmass. Every sea route that mattered was shadowed by the Union Jack. To German strategists, it was as if their country were a factory with no secure loading dock. If Britain could close the seas, German exports would suffocate. The dream of many in Berlin was therefore straightforward. Build an overland bridge to the resources and markets of the East, a route that British warships could not touch. To the southeast lay the Ottoman Empire, a once formidable state whose armies had once threatened Vienna itself. By the late 19th century, however, the Ottomans were known as the sick man of Europe. They had lost large parts of the Balkans. Nationalist uprisings gnawed at their remaining provinces, and their military lagged badly behind European rivals in organization and technology. Worst of all, the imperial treasury was effectively controlled by foreign creditors. Decades of costly wars and haphazard borrowing had left the Ottoman government drowning in debt owed to British and French banks. In 1881, after a partial default, the empire surrendered a portion of its fiscal sovereignty to a body called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This board of European officials took direct control of lucrative revenue streams, taxes on salt, tobacco, silk, spirits, and more. If the farmer in Anatolia sold a bag of salt, or a merchant in Syria paid stamp duty, a large share of that money bypassed the Sultan's treasury and went straight, in effect, to London and Paris. Sultan Abdul Hamid II understood that his empire was being slowly eaten alive by this financial arrangement. He needed a way to move troops quickly, tie the far-flung provinces together, and spark economic development, without turning even more of his state over to British or French control. At home, British newspapers began to turn the project into a symbol of German menace. Editorials warned that the railway would be a militarized spear aimed at India, that it would help barbarous Turks suppress Christians in the Balkans and Armenians in Anatolia, that it was not about trade but about domination. The same public that had once cheered railways as engines of progress was told that this particular line represented a dark plot against civilization. Behind the headlines, the City of London quietly enforced a financial quarantine. British investors were discouraged or outright prevented from placing their money in the railway or associated ventures. depriving the project of the era's deepest capital pool. The hope in London was that without British funds, the line would stall. Yet German commitment remained strong, and construction moved ahead. Engineers blasted tunnels through the Taurus and Amanus mountains, threw bridges over gorges, and pushed rails across the Anatolian plateau. Progress was slow, expensive, and technically demanding, but by 1914, the line had reached deep into southern Turkey. There were still gaps, especially in the roughest mountain sections, but the skeleton of the route was in place. German and British planners alike understood that if peace lasted another decade, the missing links would likely be completed. The black line on the map would become a functioning artery, and Britain's ability to squeeze Germany through naval blockades would be permanently weakened. In London, the reaction moved from curiosity to alarm, to something close to panic. British strategists saw that the railway would run within striking distance of the Suez Canal and would connect directly to territories whose oil could power their own fleet. If the line reached the Persian Gulf, German-made goods could flood Indian and Asian markets, undercutting British merchants, who until then enjoyed the advantage of imperial preference and naval protection. More fundamentally, the entire strategic doctrine of Britain, rule the seas, hold the choke points, and you can afford to be generous elsewhere, would be compromised by a corridor that ignored the oceans altogether. Stopping this line became an unofficial but urgent priority. Britain had several tools it could use short of open war. Diplomatically, the Foreign Office moved to block the railway's access to the sea. At the expected terminus near the Gulf, Britain cultivated and pressured the Sheikh of Kuwait, turning his small coastal domain into a strategic lever. In a secret agreement, the Sheikh promised not to lease or sell land to any foreign power without British consent. On paper, this looked like protection of a small state. In practice, it ensured that the Berlin-Baghdad line could not extend to a suitable deepwater port without London's approval. Even if the tracks reached Basra or nearby, they would end in shallow or politically constrained harbours, limiting their ability to function as a true alternative to ocean shipping. At home, British newspapers began to turn the project into a symbol of German menace. Editorials warned that the railway would be a militarized spear aimed at India, that it would help barbarous Turks oppress Christians in the Balkans and Armenians in Anatolia, that it was not about trade but about domination. The same public that had once cheered railways as engines of progress was told that this particular line represented a dark plot against civilization. Behind the headlines, the City of London quietly enforced a financial quarantine. British investors were discouraged or outright prevented from placing their money in the railway or associated ventures, depriving the project of the era's deepest capital pool. The hope in London was that without British funds, the line would stall. Yet German commitment remained strong, and construction moved ahead. Engineers blasted tunnels through the Taurus and Amanus mountains, threw bridges over gorges, and pushed rails across the Anatolian plateau. Progress was slow, expensive, and technically demanding, but by 1914, the line had reached deep into southern Turkey. There were still gaps, especially in the roughest mountain sections, but the skeleton of the route was in place. German and British planners alike understood that if peace lasted another decade, the missing links would likely be completed. The black line on the map would become a functioning artery, and Britain's ability to squeeze Germany through naval blockades would be permanently weakened. The formal cause of World War I, II. Bullets fired in Sarajevo at Archduke Franz Ferdinand is familiar. Less familiar is how the railway accented and intensified the fears that drove Europe into rigid alliances. Germany, feeling encircled by Britain, France and Russia, saw the Berlin-Baghdad project as one of the few levers it had to project influence beyond Europe. Russia, worried about a stronger Ottoman ally on its southern border and resenting any German presence near the Caucasus, viewed the line with suspicion. France, nursing grievances from the Franco-Prussian War and wary of German economic ascendance, opposed anything that would make Berlin less dependent on Western markets. For Britain, the line was the physical embodiment of its worst strategic nightmare, a rival power, gaining secure overland access to both the rich markets of Asia and the oil fields that would drive 20th century warfare. The alliance system that emerged, the Triple Entente against the Central Powers, cannot be fully understood without acknowledging this. Economic and geographic contest over corridors and choke points. When war came in 1914, the railway instantly became more than a commercial project. German staff planners hoped that, even in its incomplete state, it would help move troops and supplies to the Ottoman front and bind the alliance physically. The Ottomans, joining the Central Powers in the hope that a German victory would free them from British and French financial control, looked to the line as a lifeline. But the technical gaps and political constraints proved crippling. Trains still had to stop at unfinished sections, unload cargo, transfer it by cart, truck, or camel over mountain passes, and reload it onto other trains beyond. Every break in the line was a bottleneck that limited how much men and materiel could flow eastward. The British, meanwhile, treated the Middle Eastern theatre not as a sideshow, but as a priority. One of their earliest large-scale land operations of the war was not on the Western Front but in Mesopotamia. A British and Indian expeditionary force landed at Basra in 1914, ostensibly to protect the Anglo-Persian oil company's installations at Abadan. The deeper goal was to follow the rivers and the projected route of the railway northwards, to secure Baghdad, Mosul, and Kirkuk before Germany and the Ottomans could consolidate control. The campaign was brutal and mismanaged at first. At Kut al-Amara, an entire British Indian division surrendered to Ottoman forces after a disastrous siege, but Britain had the advantage of naval supply and global resources. Over time, reinforcements and reorganized command allowed them to push up the Tigris and Euphrates, eventually taking Baghdad in 1917 and positioning themselves to dominate the region's oil. While soldiers fought and died across deserts and rivers, British and French officials in Europe were already deciding the region's political future. In 1916, in the middle of the war, Sir Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot met to sketch out how the Ottoman territories would be divided if the Allies won. On a map, they drew lines that would later become the borders of modern Iraq. Syria, Lebanon, and other states, these lines did not respect tribal territories, sectarian balances, or economic logic. But if you overlay the proposed route of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway and the known locations of oil deposits at the time, a pattern emerges. Britain claimed the southern Iraqi corridor to the Gulf and key positions like Haifa on the Mediterranean, ensuring access to both oil and maritime outlets. France claimed much of Syria and Lebanon. The sections of the railway fell under different mandates, preventing it from ever functioning as a unified line. The project that had once promised to bind Europe and the Middle East into a single commercial zone was intentionally fragmented. A train might still run in pieces, within Turkey, within French Syria, within British Iraq, but the integrated route that had terrified London was dead. The immediate victims of this great power maneuvering were the peoples who had hoped for self-determination, Arab leaders who had fought alongside the British, encouraged by promises of post-war independence, found themselves under new European rule. T. Lawrence's guerrillas had blown up stretches of the very railway the Ottomans relied on, believing they were helping to birth a new Arab order. Instead, they helped clear the way for mandates and protectorates. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled, the Sultan deposed, the Caliphate abolished. The debts that had shackled the old empire were not erased. They were restructured and assigned to the newly carved states. The British Empire, however, achieved its main strategic objectives. It had prevented Germany from establishing a stable overland bridge to the Gulf, secured control over key oil fields, and maintained its grip on routes to India, at least for a few more decades. In the interwar years, the logic of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway lived on in altered form. With political control over Iraq and influence in the surrounding region, Britain and its partners chose not to resurrect the line as an integrated trade route. Instead, they prioritized pipelines. The newly formed Iraq Petroleum Company, a consortium of British, French, and later American firms, built pipelines from Kirkuk's oil fields to ports on the Mediterranean. Like the railway, these pipelines ran from the interior to the coast along strategically chosen corridors. Unlike the railway, they moved only oil, not people or ideas, and were easier to monitor and defend. The dream once sold to the Ottomans, that infrastructure would modernize their lands and integrate them into global prosperity, was replaced by a more one-sided reality, extractive infrastructure designed primarily to send wealth outward. At home, British newspapers began to turn the project into a symbol of German menace. Editorials warned that the railway would be a militarized spear aimed at India, that it would help barbarous Turks oppress Christians in the Balkans and Armenians in Anatolia, that it was not about trade but about domination. The same public that had once cheered railways as engines of progress was told that this particular line represented a dark plot against civilization. Behind the headlines, the City of London quietly enforced a financial quarantine. British investors were discouraged or outright prevented from placing their money in the railway or associated ventures, depriving the project of the era's deepest capital pool. The hope in London was that without British funds, the line would stall. Yet German commitment remained strong, and construction moved ahead. engineers blasted tunnels through the Taurus and Amanus mountains, threw bridges over gorges, and pushed rails across the Anatolian plateau. Progress was slow, expensive, and technically demanding, but by 1914, the line had reached deep into southern Turkey. There were still gaps, especially in the roughest mountain sections, but the skeleton of the route was in place. German and British planners alike understood that if peace lasted another decade, the missing links would likely be completed. The black line on the map would become a functioning artery, and Britain's ability to squeeze Germany through naval blockades would be permanently weakened. The story of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway reminds us that infrastructure is never neutral. A road, a railway, a pipeline is always also a political act, a bet on how power and trade will flow. The Ottomans believed they could use German money and engineering to free themselves from British and French financial domination while remaining independent. Instead, by hosting a project that threatened an aging hegemon, they turned their territory into a battlefield for others' ambitions. The train that was supposed to bring them prosperity and security brought armies and partition instead. Today, when developing states' way offers to build ports, rail lines and high-speed corridors, they face a similar dilemma. Accept investment and risk becoming an arena in a larger conflict, or remain underdeveloped and dependent on existing powers. We often talk about World War I as if it were an inexplicable tragedy born of nationalism and miscalculation. We talk about the modern Middle East as if its borders and conflicts were the product of ancient hatreds. But if you dig through the rhetoric and look at the maps, you find the shadow of a railway that was never finished. You see that many of the borders drawn after the war were designed not to create viable nations, but to ensure that no overland route could again threaten maritime empires. The world we inhabit, the wars we fight in the Levant, the prices we pay for fuel, the anxiety great powers feel when a rival announces a new corridor, was shaped by a line of steel that never quite reached the sea. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway did not survive, but the fear it provoked still echoes in every argument about who will control the connections of the 21st century.